What makes a research question great? And how can you ask one for this class? The most important characteristic of a quality research question is how genuinely interested you are in pursuing its answer. Great research questions are ones for which the author has an authentic connection. The question should be personally meaningful for the researcher and interesting to readers as well. Great research questions are complex enough that they need to be explored by investigating multiple sources of information, such as scholarly or popular articles, interviews, personal observation and experience. Great research questions can be answered only with well-evidenced arguments about them, instead of with simple facts. Conversely, great research questions are narrow and specific enough to be answered. An important point to keep in mind is that great research questions are not topics. A topic is a broad matter or a subject, like climate change or immigration. Thinking of a topic when writing a research question is an okay place to start, but you have to work to narrow a topic down considerably to make it work. So, what about climate change specifically would you be interested in pursuing? If you wondered, for example, about the effects of climate change on the culture of the Gullah Geechee people, descendants of slaves who have lived along the South Carolina coast for centuries, you have a research question and not a topic. It would be even better if you were specific about what aspect of their culture you were looking into, like their fishing or agricultural practices. Here are some examples of great research questions written by former English 101 students at John Jay. These students had different class themes than you guys did, like race and language or New York City, but you can definitely get a sense of how well-developed research questions sound with these. So one of them is, in what ways do Asian kids raised by white adoptive parents face discrimination? How do Asian adoptees' experiences with racism differ from those of children of other races who were also adopted by white parents? So I think this came from a class where the focus was on race. And so this came from a student who herself was adopted, Asian student adopted by white parents. And so she wanted to see if there were representative experiences across other adoptees and did so pretty effectively with this paper. This one I think also, or came from a different class, this one about race and language. What effect does New York City's diversity have on the way people use language in the city? Does a diverse city like New York act like a catalyst for language growth and multilingualism? Or are cities like New York testaments to the barriers that it can exist between people who speak different languages? So that's interesting. So that's kind of a research question about, like, if you, for example, lived in a neighborhood of people who speak a different language than you, would you start to pick up aspects of that language and maybe integrate them into your speech? Does New York promote that? Or instead, does it kind of create these like pockets or enclaves of language use? This one is totally different. This one is about, it seems sort of personal, but at the same time, you can see how there might be a broader application. So this person wants to know, how have other people besides themselves dealt with experiences of overwhelming disappointment in their lives? How did they get over their disappointment? How did coming up with a plan B alter the course of some people's lives? And what's the best way for somebody to manage disappointment and come up with new ideas for happiness? And this seems like a really interesting one because it's connected to experiences we all have, right, where we become disappointed periodically. But it's also kind of looking at like the science of happiness. There's a whole field of happiness studies, but you can see how this is also personally meaningful and potentially impactful for the author too, who's learning, strategies for managing the disappointment that we all face. Okay, a couple more quickly. What are the origins of the English only movement in America? So that's a movement where, as it sounds, in schools or other institutions, you're supposed to use only English. And in what ways has this movement shaped the way we teach English as a second language in school? Oh, that's interesting. So then, right, a causal relationship between the English only movement and the way that we're teaching ESL. And then finally, this one within the United States prison system, what is the rationale for solitary confinement? What are the consequences of solitary confinement for the prisoners who experience it? So again, you know, these are not topics, right? Like the topic for this one would be something like, you know, prison reform. It's a large category. But then when you're like, well, what about prison reform? Then this person might be like, I'm interested particularly in solitary confinement. Okay, well, what again about solitary confinement? You're getting smaller and smaller, right? So what's the rationale? Like, when did solitary confinement start? Why? And then also, what are the implications for the individual prisoner? So you can sort of see that it becomes a much more focused question. All of these, by the way, were taken from essays that won awards for English 101. There's an award ceremony at the end of the semester and at the end of your second semester as well, where people who write really good essays are honored. So that's where all of these came from. I hope that gave you a stronger sense of what a good research question is and why. Remember, you want them to be personally meaningful. You want them to be narrow enough that you can actually research them and write about them in like a 4 or 5 page paper, but broad enough that they might be interesting to other people. And that's it. Thank you for listening.